Good afternoon. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. This Tuesday, June 9th. We are meeting today for an hour and a half from 4:30 to 6 p.m. in order to study Bill C-27. We are televised, and pursuant to the order of reference of Friday, May 8th, 2009, we are studying Bill C-27, an act to promote the efficiency and adaptability of the Canadian economy by regulating certain activities that discourage reliance on electronics means of carrying out commercial activities, and to amend the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission Act, the Competition Act, the Personal Information Protection and Electronics Documents Act, and the Telecommunications Act. We have appearing in front of us the Honourable Tony Clement, Minister of Industry, and two of his officials, Madame Helen MacDonald, Assistant Deputy Minister of Spectrum, Information Technologies and Telecommunications, and Mr. Richard Simpson, Director General of the Electronics Commerce Branch. Welcome to all of you, and welcome as well to our Mexican delegation who will be sitting in the audience observing the Canadian parliamentary system at work. So I welcome the Mexican delegation from the United States of Mexico. Without further ado, we'll begin with the Minister for his opening comments with respect to this bill.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you to members of the committee, of course, for the opportunity to meet the committee to discuss Bill C-27, the proposed Electronic Commerce Protection Act, or ECPA. And joining me today, we have two officials, Helen MacDonald, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Spectrum, Information Technologies and Telecommunications, and Mr. Richard Simpson, who's the Director General of the Electronic Commerce Branch of Industry Canada. Mr. Chairman, in a little more than a decade, the Internet has become a critical medium not only for communications but also for competing in the global economy. It has become an essential part of the daily lives of Canadians and essential to Canadian business. Toutefois, au cours des dernières années,
however, in recent years, the Internet and the online economy have become more vulnerable with the rapid growth and increasing sophistication of spam and other online threats.
Encouraging the growth of electronic commerce by ensuring business confidence and consumer trust in the online marketplace. In 2007, one report estimated that the global cost of spam was at $100 billion American per year. $100 billion per year. Canada's share of this cost would be about $3 billion. And so unsolicited commercial email is more than just a nuisance. Along with the development of associated threats like malware, spyware, phishing, and various viruses, worms and trojans, spam has become a major disruption to the Internet and to the Canadian economy as a whole. A growing chorus of voices across the nation have called for legislation to protect Canadians and the Canadian economy from spam. Et la Chambre du commerce du Canada est décrit
The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has described spam as a considerable burden not only to consumers but to the business community. Major industry associations, including the Canadian Marketing Association, the Canadian Bankers Association, the Information Technology Association of Canada, and the Canadian Association of Internet Providers, have called for new laws to address this issue. In October 2007, 9 major industry representatives at the Canada Roundtable on the Future of the Internet Economy confirmed their support for legislative action to deal with spam and other threats to the Internet. Mr. Chairman, we have listened to these concerns and the concerns of millions of Canadians who have seen their email cluttered and clogged with spam, and their computers compromised by the threats that spam causes when it slips into their software and disrupts their lives. Mr. Chair, it is time to act.
Support this bill has received from both sides of the House. In fact, I must say that several parliamentarians have been calling for some time for legislation that would curb spam and other threats to the Internet and the online economy. Senator Donald Oliver, for instance, in the other place has introduced bills to combat spam. And during last September's election campaign, the Prime Minister announced that if re-elected, the government would introduce anti-spam legislation. And in fact, I would also like to acknowledge Senator Goldstein and his bill S-220, which was introduced in the other place in last February. I believe that the bill before us improves upon his bill in that it empowers specific agencies at royal assent that would have the power to enforce the law, the CRTC, the Competition Bureau, and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. Like Bill S-220, the Commons Bill, rather, also allows for a private right of action. Now, the honourable member from Pickering Scarborough East emphasized the need for international action against spam. I would point out that the bill before us provides the CRTC, the Competition Bureau, and as I said, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, not only with the authority to work with one another, but to work with their international counterparts. The honourable member from Pickering Scarborough East also pointed out that the importance of administrative monetary penalties that have teeth. I should mention to this committee that this bill provides for AMPs up to a maximum of $1 million per violation for individuals and up to $10 million for businesses. During our debate in the Commons, other members from the Liberal benches spoke in favour of the principles of this bill. The honourable member from Scarborough Rouge River told the House that he was pleased to see the private right of action included in the bill. And this right, of course, would allow users and businesses to take civil action against anyone who violates the Act. This remedy has been very effective in the United States, Mr. Chairman, and is one example of how we have adopted the best practices from around the world. The NDP have a solid history of favouring anti-spam legislation. Last fall, their election platform contained a commitment to, quote, combat identity theft and control online computer fraud against consumers and seniors against spamming and phishing. During second reading, the honourable member from Nanaimo, Cowichan, reminded us of spam's impact on the productivity of Canadian workers. She reminded us that Canada is the only G7 country without anti-spam legislation, and I would like to assure her through you that the bill before us benefits from the best practices of the jurisdictions that have gone before us in introducing anti-spam laws. The honourable member from Timmins James Bay has been an outspoken champion for protecting Canadians from spam. When speaking to this bill, he expressed concern about the implications that C-27 will have on the national Do Not Call list. As well, from the Liberal Party, the honourable member from Scarborough Rouge River also raised concerns about the national Do Not Call list. I should mention to this committee that the Do Not Call list is up and running, and it is effective with over 6 million Canadians signed up. So at this point in time, of course, we always have the ability to review these things, but we would like to see the DNCL continue for the time being, and we do not want to shelve it with this legislation at this particular moment in time. As my parliamentary secretary indicated during second reading debate, C-27 will not abolish Do Not Call. In fact, Section 6 sub 7 enhances Do Not Call lists because it carves out telemarketing by exempting, quote, interactive voice communications, facsimiles, and voice recordings to telephone accounts from the application of the Act. It's well known, however, that with the convergence of technologies, the distinction between voice telephony and internet-carried communications, well, for all intents and purposes, it's disappearing. So paragraphs 84 to 86, which could repeal Section 41 of the Telecommunications Act and the Do Not Call, would not be proclaimed by the government until necessary to deal with such changes. That is to say, we are going to continue to monitor how this particular aspect of the bill changes over time, and of course we will have the flexibility to react to those changes. The Bloc spoke in favor of the principles of this bill, and the honourable member from Chicoutimi Fjord reminded us of the increase in the amount of spam and wondered whether businesses were changing the way they contact consumers. Before the debate adjourned on May 7th, I believe it was the honourable member from Jeanne Labert was about to make a point about the difficulty of policing the Internet. It's unfortunate that the debate was cut off at that moment because I appreciate the concerns about the challenge of enforcement when communications technologies know no borders. However, I'd like to assure the committee that it is indeed possible for anti-spam laws to have a huge impact. In Australia, for example, after the Spam Act came into effect, the proportion of global spam originating from that country was greatly reduced. Some major spammers, particularly pornographic spammers, closed their Australian operations altogether. So, Mr. Chairman, during second reading, two themes recurred in most of the interventions. First of all parties support the intent of this bill. We just want to ensure that we get the details right. Secondly, many speakers said that they looked forward to examining the bill in greater detail here at committee. I'm pleased that we have the opportunity now to do just that. So I encourage members to read it through, to understand the intent, to ask questions, and you will see that the legislation in front of you is solid, considered, and will make a big difference to protecting Canadians in the online marketplace. On that note, Mr. Chairman, I'd be very pleased to hear from the committee members, and I expect that if there are more technical aspects of this bill, we have departmental officials who are present to answer your questions and clarify those more technical provisions that may require explanation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. We'll have about 1 hour and 15 minutes of questions and comments from members, beginning with Monsieur Garneau.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank the Minister for his comments, and I would like to reiterate to him in no uncertain terms that the Liberal Party welcomes Bill C-27 in the interests of combating spam. There's no question that we're very glad to see this as a follow-up to the task force that rendered its report back in 2005. However, having said that, there are some very significant concerns that have been expressed certainly to myself in the course of the last few weeks concerning C-27. In a sense, if I could try to summarize it, the net has been cast in order to eliminate spam, but it has been cast in such a broad manner, and the devil is in the details, that there are significant concerns about it having some negative effects. The net being cast so broadly has also left certain definitions so general that the interpretation of something as simple as a computer program can be taken in a number of ways. If I could, with respect to the anti-spam provisions, the scope is too broad at this point. To get specific, the consent provisions that are contained in the bill and exclusions are too narrow. The unsubscribed requirements are unworkable, and this could have a chill on the legitimate commercial speech and e-commerce. Now, we want to help to fix that because the anti-spam bill is a good thing, but we have a lot of work in front of us in order to address some of the specific concerns that have been expressed to us by people who also want to see Bill C-27 come into play. As a first question, has the team that put together the bill, I assume it has done this, but there are more recent examples of legislation in other countries. You mentioned Australia. Australia is an example. New Zealand is another. Have other countries' legislations been consulted in the process of putting this together? Because at first sight, some of what they have done appears to address many of the concerns that have been expressed to me by various different organizations.
Thank you. I'll just pass it over to Helen.
The United States has also been consulted And that is where we got the notion for the private right of action.
And New Zealand and Australia?
New Zealand and Australia, yes,
okay,
absolutely.
So you have, well, I would suggest that we need to look at some of the things that they have done that get around some of the objections with respect to the scope being too broad in this particular case. And in terms of defining some of the words that are used in this legislation, let me bring up a couple of examples. One has to do with extraterritorial provisions. And the anti-spam and message-altering provisions that exist at the moment apply to any message where a computer system located in Canada is used to send, route, or access the electronic message. Now, the key word here is route. As you know, the way the Internet works, we can have information flowing through Canadian computer systems that don't originate in Canada and are not ultimately going to end up in Canada. And so the use of the word route is problematic in this particular case. That is an example that I think that perhaps you may want to address that, but we need to address that.
Mr. Simpson, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. It certainly is a valid point that spam is a global problem, and therefore legislation has to take account of international arrangements as well as put forward the right legal powers to tackle spam domestically. And the example of Australia is a good one, where they've tried to make sure that their domestic rules through an Australian link apply with respect to international origins of spam. In respect to the point about Internet transmissions and how those are global because of the nature of the Internet. They can't be sourced in any one country, but they go through the whole network and then arrive at their destination, which could be anywhere. That's true. But the Act does, or the bill rather, does provide for a specific exemption for telecommunications service providers when they're performing the function of telecommunications. Therefore, it's a waiver, if I can use that term, for the function of carriage, which certainly the example that you use about the Internet would be captured by that. So I think that hopefully we won't get caught by a specific transmission function that is going to be subject to any of these anti-spam provisions, certainly not as it relates to telecommunications service providers.
Getting back to defining some of the terminology here, when we think of HTML files that are regularly used in accessing websites, or JavaScript, which is another common example, or updating programs that some of us use, for example, Symantec antivirus software, those would not be looked upon as spam, and yet by the definitions that exist within Section 8, I believe it is, could be looked upon as being spam. And so again, that is something that needs to be tightened up, and it needs to be clarified so that it doesn't create serious impediments to legitimate users.
No, and we have noted that particular concern about Section 8. I can tell you, Mr. Garneau, and I can tell you that I guess what we're trying to do is provide the right balance. Clearly, if you're getting an upgrade, if there's an implied consent or some other mechanism so that we can have these reinstallations or upgrades in our computers. That's an obvious legitimate practice. So we've got to make sure that that is legitimate, but we don't want to leave the barn door so wide open that the bad guys can use that as the way to get the spam in. So we're prepared to work with you to get the right kind of language that will balance this off appropriately.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you, Mr. Garneau. Monsieur Bouchard.
Oui. Merci. Monsieur le ministre, vous savez que le Bloc québécois a donné son appui au niveau de la deuxième lecture. En comité, nous voulons entendre les témoins pour voir comment...
We want to hear the witnesses, to hear what our witnesses have to say. I would like to know this. There are 3 authorities in the bill that will be concerned by it. The CRTC, the Competition Bureau, the Privacy Commissioner as well. So I would like to hear what you have to say about the role of each of these bodies and the coordination. How will that happen so that the system works effectively with these 3 major players involved? Are these institutions going to be talking to each other? So I'd like to hear your comments on this, to know how each party's role will be respected and how users and consumers are going to benefit. Thank you. I would ask my officials to add to my answer, but I will say a few words myself. There's the final report of the task force on spam, and it is recommended that the application of the provisions of the Act that deals with spam should be carried out by existing organizations or bodies. And of course, that means that the CRTC, the Competition Bureau, and the Privacy Commission, these all exist, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and we can use these organizations in order to fight spam. It's a similar approach is used in the legislation of other countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. They use the same approach. Perhaps Ms. McDonald would like to add something to that.
Trying to build on the existing mandates and competencies of these 3 agencies. And therefore, the CRTC you could look at as the major organization charged with stopping the spread of spam and the use of spyware. When we look at the other 2 agencies, we are trying to build on their mandates to make sure that the Competition Bureau can apply its rules around and its role around misleading and deceptive advertising in a computer environment. So we've enlarged their mandate, but they're using their existing tools. With the Privacy Commissioner, we want to make sure that she has the tools to prevent electronic lists from being created that can be then farmed and used for spam. So for those Privacy Commissioner and for the Competition Bureau, they have existing mandates. We're extending their mandates, but they're using their existing tool set. With the CRTC, we are creating, in a sense, another tribunal that will be able to look at violations with respect to spam and to take action appropriately. To ensure that coordination that you were concerned about, we are proposing a small organization within Industry Canada that would make sure that the 3 organizations are working together effectively to achieve the purposes of this legislation, and to make sure that when we look at our situation more broadly, that Canada is continuing to be not a safe haven for spam, but a spam-free environment. So there'll be a national coordinating body within Industry Canada that will make sure the 3 work together effectively. There is also a spam reporting center proposed that people could send reports of spam to, and it would serve all 3 agencies to prevent unnecessary duplication.
But as you know, spam makes the internet system almost ineffective. It's very harmful to the whole issue of the efficiency of emails. And the bill talks about isolating telemarketing from other measures set out in the bill. From what I understand about telemarketing, it is solicitation by way of the internet. How can a bill ensure protection against all of this type of solicitation? So the first thing that we do is that we go to our workstation and we clean things up in our email. So users are going to continue to receive messages from telemarketers, messages we don't need. I'd like to hear from you on this. How can you assure us that users will be protected, that consumers will be protected on their personal computers and on the internet? We've got the do not call list, of course, for telephone communications. But there is a convergence of technologies in our lives nowadays, and it is possible to have a situation whereby in the future there could be a convergence with telephone and the internet, but for the time being, we do have the do not call list, and for other communications methods such as the internet, there will be a system put in place by the legislation.
The do not call list, in his remarks, why the do not call list should continue. It's a fairly new regime. It's still finding its feet, and we believe it can be effective. But if you are talking or worried about spam that comes, telemarketing usually refers to a voice-to-voice communication, and that is what is covered by the do not call list. If you're worried about text messaging on cell phones, that's not voice-to-voice. That's people sending messages via the internet. That would be covered by this. And spam, which is just computer-generated electronic emails, so long as they are unsolicited commercial messages, would be covered by this.
Thank you.
So it's two regimes that are being maintained for the time being. And as the minister said, one might want to look in the future if people start moving to computer-generated voices that leave messages on your home phone, it becomes complex, and the way the bill is structured, the government would have the opportunity to react quickly.
Thank you, Madame MacDonald. Thank you. Merci, Monsieur Bouchard. Nous allons have...
We go now to Mr. Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Obviously, when we're looking at an issue like this, we have a bit of a challenge to find, as with all legislation, a balanced approach. In this case, I think that the challenge is to find the balance between catching the bad guys, I guess, the most sort of malignant forms of spam, and yet still allowing businesses to contact their legitimate clients without worries of someone knocking on their door to take them away. Can you maybe clarify a little bit about how this bill sort of captures that balance, maybe from the side of addressing these concerns that might be expressed by the business community?
Well, certainly, you know, I think that for instance, there are legitimate email marketers, for instance, who want to communicate with their clientele And what we've tried to do is create both explicit consent and implied consent in those situations. So where the person, where there's a pre-existing business relationship, for instance. So let's say, you know, I used to be in the legal beagle business, and let's say you've got clients. You're a lawyer. You've got clients, and you want to send them updates about particular aspects of changes in the law. Let's say anti-spam legislation, for instance. You know, obviously there's a pre-existing business relationship, and those kinds of things that does imply some consent by the receiver of that information, by the consumer of that information. So we're not trying to interfere with the legitimate email practices of legitimate businesses. Of course, we have the implied consent mentioned in the legislation. We can further hone that down in the regulations as well, where we can describe further circumstances where marketers can rely on implied consent. But again, we're not trying to interfere with the existing business relationships. We're trying to deal with bad guys who are right now they can drive the truck through the open barn door because there's no regulation right now.
Right. Question for Ms. McDonald or Mr. Simpson. In terms of the oftentimes you go through legislation like this, once you put it out there, there's you know, folks that want to comment on it and express concerns or get some clarification. I imagine that you've had some folks comment or contact you regarding this. What kind of common concerns have there been expressed at this point?
There are concerns around the consent regime. Have we got the balance right? And how would implied consent be considered? As the minister said, you don't want to open the door too broadly, and therefore we've tried to strike a balance that ensures that pre-existing business relationship, which could be I've expressed interest in a product or service, that's an implied consent. We hope that that would be sufficient, but we look for your investigations on that. I think Mr. Garneau had raised the question about the computer programs, and is there an issue with the downloading of software to keep your computer virus-free? Have we got the wording a little too restrictive on that, I think has been the concern. Should that be a softer, more implied consent or an explicit consent program by program? I think those are the two major concerns that we have heard. Okay.
In terms of the other countries' anti-spam legislation that's referred to, and from what I understand has been a real success in those countries, are there any lessons to be learned or any response that can be given or experience drawn upon based on the knowledge that we have of those countries' legislation that might address some of the concerns that some stakeholders might have?
I'm going to ask Richard to answer that, given his greater experience in putting this together, but also because he interacts most closely with other countries with similar regimes.
Thank you. The one common denominator that has come out of work in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which started the examination of spam and other harmful activity on the Internet a few years ago, was that you need a combination of tools, legal and also technical, to deal with spam. So I think that's the first lesson, and the legislative side of it, which I think has been recognized in the work that we've been doing on spam, is one of those important pieces of that toolkit approach that we need. And I think you'll find in every country that has a successful result from spam, from their work on spam, for example, Australia, they have a toolkit approach. In fact, Australia, like Canada, talked about toolkits at the same time. The OECD promoted that particular approach. Again, with Australia, they have taken an approach towards spam, which again, like this bill, is based on the concept of consent. They have, as I mentioned before, looked at it as a domestic regime that has to work in combination with international arrangements to deal with spamming. And it's interesting that in Australia, and also another similarity is to Bill C-27 is that the Australians do use their communications regulator as well to deal with some aspects of spam. But it's interesting that Australia is a country that formally reviewed its anti-spam legislation in 2006 after about 3 years in operation. And they actually found out from the data that because of the legislative arrangements they put in place, they had reduced Australia's contribution, if we can use that word, to global spam to something that was well down in the list, off the top 20 list of spam originating countries. So that's, I think, a good example of how that toolkit approach has been effective in that one country.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Thank you, Mr. Lake. Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here, and thanks for noting the democratic policy from the last platform, and feel free to act on our position on net neutrality and employment insurance reform as well, if you like, as other suggestions of priorities. But I would like to know, Mr. Minister, though, I know that you've heard these problems with regards to some of the types of issues being raised here. Do you plan right now to bring amendments to this legislation, or is it one right now as you want to pass in current form?
No, I think, look, I take this committee seriously, and if we can, if you've got some suggestions, some common sense suggestions that would fit into what our aspirations are for this particular bill, then I think we're prepared to look at that, absolutely. Okay. So I encourage you to do that. The only thing I would say, and I guess Mr. Garneau raised this a little bit, we do consider this economic legislation. There's $3 billion a year of effect on business in this country. So I think we should hunker down at committee, come up with some positive changes that will make this a better bill. I don't want to stretch this out too long because, quite frankly, we're costing businesses in our country money, and we're considered we're the only country in the G7 that doesn't have anti-spam legislation. So I think it's incumbent upon us to get the shoulder to the wheel and get this done.
Well, I appreciate that, and I agree as long as we can do the proper bill, and then we could also move on to my private member's bill, C-273, as well. So
this is a paid political announcement.
Yeah. But I do want to run through a couple scenarios to be clear here. I want to make sure that I understand the interpretations that are happening here, as well as this is information coming into us. Would, say, for example, automatic updates, would that be considered spam under this bill if it's passed?
You mean with a pre-existing relationship?
Yeah.
That's what we're saying. We would like that to be part of implied consent. But Helen, you want to talk about that?
As it currently stands in terms of interpretation, this is what I have a couple scenarios here.
It's currently written as express consent for program modifications.
Okay, so that would be spam then?
No.
Right, under right now?
No, I haven't said that. I'm simply saying the spam itself allows for implied and express consent. The modification of your computer program requires express consent the way it's written now. And it does it kind of program by program. I imagine there are easily ways in your contract, whether that's electronic or paper, with your, say, security software provider. One could provide that express consent for, yes, I want the automatic updates and so on. So I would not see that as problematic. I think what we're trying to make sure is the wording we've got of the combination of you agree to every explicit program and express consent, that we've got that worded correctly.
Okay, that could be through regulations and licensing. Real quickly then, would, say for example, a new software company that wants to communicate with other software distributions and distributors and that, would they be able to send out a message to everyone within their own field of software development, or would they then, would that be considered spam, or would they have to rely on traditional mail to be able to contact maybe people that they haven't had contact before in the business but are integral for developing that industry?
There's a provision for business-to-business email.
But it's not. Yeah. But even if they have no pre-existing relationship.
Yeah.
Okay. And as well, real quickly, I do want to touch on the do not call list briefly. What other types of, I guess, changes do you maybe foresee? And would this bill, one of the things that I tried to get in the do not call list last time was the computerized ghost call that happens to individuals first when they determine whether you're home or not, and then it hangs up right away. That amendment was defeated, unfortunately, when we passed that bill. Would this provide an opportunity to address that issue? Because that's becoming more and more of a problem where, you know, you're at home and they do the first phone call and if you pick it up, then it's blank, it's dead air. And then from there, the telephone solicitor or the operative then calls you back immediately knowing that the person is at home. Would that be a potential, would it be a remedy in this bill here?
I would say no, because our bill is dealing with electronic communications, not using of telephony for your medium. But it's becoming difficult to separate these things out. Basically, yeah. That's what I was trying to signal in my remarks. And we have a contract with Bell right now, where they run the do not call list. So I want to obviously let that contract kind of run. And then this bill gives us an opportunity then to start to see have things converged to such an extent that you really can't chunk out, you know, telephony in one end and electronic on the other, and then we will have we'll have an ability to tuck everything into the same kind of regime.
Okay, because I think there's some fear that, I mean, that's being expressed out there about what, you know, this potentially could open up and the vulnerabilities that do not call list, but.
I don't think so. I think it's expressly excluded, and then, but it gives us a chance to sort of tuck it in if we so choose.
Okay. I'm just trying to be precise here.
That's better than
two-way voice communications is the carve-out we've made to keep the do not call list whole. I'm not familiar enough with what a ghost call is, whether that is a computer-generated call.
They often use a computer system. Well, it could. It's basically somebody calls you first for telephone marketing, and they hang up on you. Right. And often they use a computerized system to pull the numbers up. And then if you're at home, then they.
Yeah, I know those calls. Believe me. Yeah. We're all victims of these calls. So yeah. I'm waiting to strangle the guy that has the Captain Stubing guy with the wonderful ship in the background with tooting its horn, but that's the one that really bugs me the most. But
we've had the clarification. The ghost call would be covered under the do not call list.
Okay. Do not call list.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Mr. Rhoda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Minister, for coming out today. One of the concerns, of course, spam, I think, is something that concerns all of us, and we wanted to see some kind of legislation out there that would prevent unwanted spam. Now, and one of the things you mentioned earlier in your speech is you wanted to encourage growth of electronic commerce, and I think that's something that has to be encouraged, and it's a wave of the future. One of the things that has come up in discussions with some of the people who are directly affected by this legislation is that the legislation doesn't zero in on one activity and stop it, or certain activities. It's basically throwing a wide net out there and stopping everything. Basically, everything is illegal except for a small list or a list of activities that are permitted. Now, that's the way it was described to me by someone who's affected directly by this. And I was wondering if you can comment on that, because, I mean, in this changing world of electronics, we have new products, new actions, new ways of doing business coming about on a regular basis. So one is maybe comment on this wide net that only allows certain activities through, and two, with the intervention of new activities or new types of new ways of doing business, how long do you see that change? How long do you see it taking to make a change so that it can adapt to a changing world?
Let me thank you for the question, and certainly if you look at the structure under Section 6, you're quite right that it's saying that no person shall do this unless you fit into the category. And I think that that's actually, I would argue that that's the appropriate way of doing it. And the reason is as follows. This area obviously is changing rapidly by the year, by the month, by the week. If we tried to itemize the things that were accepted rather than the things, rather than having a blanket prohibition, then we're going to get into a situation where we're going to miss it. The legislation would almost be out of date by the time we get around to getting royal assent. That would be my fear. You'd be constantly seeking exceptions to the general rule of openness, which is what would be the opposite of this, because other methodologies would come forward that would be legitimate methodologies, or in your case, the other things would come forward that are bad, some new form of malware, some new form of spam, that we'd have to then plug the hole and say, no, that one's excluded too. So I think it's better to exclude everything and say, no, everything is excluded. You assume that it's spam or malware unless you fit into what we know is legitimate commerce or legitimate communication under this particular bill. That's
You can understand the concern, though, if somebody's doing business and, okay, we're going to do business a certain way, and they're restricted because it's not part of the legislation and it's not defined. That's a real concern. And I just had someone from the real estate board saying, well, if a certain real estate agent hears through a friend that an acquaintance of theirs is looking for a house, well, if they have a house for sale within their portfolio, it would be illegal for them to contact that person to offer them a house or to say, look, I understand you're looking for a house. Is this something that interests you? Would that be something that would be blocked?
You want to tackle that one?
I'm sure there are other ways in which, or many ways in which, the real estate agent, if that's a particular issue, could express or made known through a friend. What we're talking about more is the mass sending out of the kind of email that clogs.
But what you're telling me is that real estate agent would be caught in this vast net that covers absolutely everything if it's not defined. And if it's not defined in there, that person can't do business. And you're impeding someone from using a tool that would be very useful to them to do business.
I don't think we've quite worked out the precise example, not being at the meeting, how they positioned this, whether there was an implied consent of,
no,
I know a real estate agent, if you'd like, he can call.
Basically, what happens is someone tells you that they have a friend who's looking for a house. That person gets an email from you. All of a sudden, that's illegal. I mean, that takes the place of taking a phone.
No, we'll get back to that.
I think Mr. Simpson might have something to add to this. Please. Mr. Simpson?
Yeah, but let me just say, I'm just looking at it quickly. I think that would be under, at the very least, you've got the ability under regulations to deal with some of these examples, like Section 6, Sub 5, Section C, would give us the power to say, no, these are acceptable commercial activities in those cases.
But you know as well as I do, Mr. Minister, or through you, Mr. Chair, that around Parliament, things don't happen instantaneously. We find holes, and it takes forever to change them. Meanwhile, industry comes to a grinding halt because we have tools that we can't use.
Yeah.
That is my concern with this legislation, is the fact that it has a very wide net that impedes business from taking place. And when I look at what's going on with the economy today, I mean, that's the last thing we need is another break on the economy. Right. And going through C-27, it's what keeps coming up. I just feel that this legislation has been put together in haste, and there's problems.
No, look, actually, this legislation has been, kicking around this department for a good long time. Other governments, previous governments, have tried to do legislation like this, have never got around to it. So I would reject the idea that this is put together in haste. I would say this, however, you can come up with examples, and I won't know the answer immediately to a particular example. But I will say this: if you want a situation where everything is open unless it's specifically excluded, then the bad guys will find a way to be excluded, and this legislation will not work. It will not protect anybody. It will not protect commerce. It will not protect business. It will not protect consumers. So I still abide by the philosophy that you exclude everything, unless it is a legitimate form of communication, in which case it's fine. I think that's a better way of looking at it.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Rhoda, for those questions. Mr. Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank you, Minister, for coming and having folks here. Can you just follow up a little bit on Mr. Rhoda's example? I think Mr. Rhoda's example is exactly what we're trying to resolve in this. If I'm a homeowner, maybe talking to my friend, talking about maybe I'd like to move, and I get a whole slew of unsolicited emails from real estate agents, I'm not happy about that. That's the whole idea. But so I don't have any problem that is my privacy, and if there's other ways for real estate agents. Now, if I give permission to my friend to tell that real estate agent to call me, email me, come to my door, mail me, that is a different story. But without permission, consent, I don't agree with it. So I'm happy with the way the legislation, it has been kicked around for a while. Could you give me a sense whether that's a year, 2 years, 3 years? Do you have any idea how long you've been working on this as not you, Minister, but staff?
Well, the origins of the bill actually go back to the work of the spam task force, as one of the members mentioned.
And how long ago was that?
Well, 2004.
2004. Thank you very much. I don't need more information. This has been working around. We have had support from our colleagues. I know there are some issues. My question about the issues that you've heard today really breaks down to two, as far as I can tell from the people who I've seen and the reading I've done on it. One is if you've got a software package and they do an overnight update on it, and they drop cookies down or they drop something on there, is that covered off? I need to know. Do you need wording changes to this bill, or do we pass it the way it is and we make a commitment to fix that during regulation? That's my first question. And the second area, which I think you've clarified considerably, is that we will not give royal assent or declare, whatever you call it, the section to deal with, because I think section 86, I think it actually repeals the section that has the do not call list in there. So if we don't declare it, or whatever we call it, it'll stay in abeyance until we need it. And we had a great example of our own committee that most of these members were here today, in a country in Africa where you don't need a card to do your banking of any sort because they do it by phone. Who knows what's coming next in this country or any other country in terms of spam and how it deals with, and that's fully integrated with their phone. And so that could be coming here, those kinds of things. So I understand that. Is there specific wording that you need, that you've been working on, right, you need changed at the committee? I don't even know if we can do it at committee. But how, from a process point of view, because I'm a little bit with Mr. Massey on this. I'd like to see this passed relatively quickly. We have our witnesses in the next few days. I think we should get on with this process. It's been hanging around way too long, and way too long. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's why people get frustrated with government, right, because we take forever to find issues when we need to move on to other projects. And I'm happy to debate Mr. Massey's bill when it eventually comes back here.
So let me just answer the question there. Just we talked a little bit about Section 8 and the anti-spyware provisions, and we talked about express consent and installation of computer programs, whether there's consent or no consent, that kind of thing. I certainly under 10 sub 2, for instance, there's some language there that could perhaps be tightened up a little bit. That we'd be.
Are you providing us that wording, or are we making that up on the fly, or what happens? That's my question.
We're looking at that wording ourselves, because we're also hearing from some groups saying, would that capture the security upgrades and so on? Right. So we're looking at that, but I think depending on the committee, the witnesses that you're calling before committee, they may also be probing into that.
Okay. I appreciate that. And just a clarification, my understanding based on my review of this, that I think it's Section 6, now you quote me wrong, but business to business, not business to consumer, but business to business is actually exempt. virtually exempt, so that if Company A wants to talk to Company B, who is in the software business, or anybody in the software business, they can send their unsolicited email to absolutely everybody, and this legislation does not cover that. Is that a correct statement? That is correct. Okay. Oh, maybe with a...
Yes, you're correct. Paragraph 6(5)(b) talks about an exception when the email is sent to a person who's engaged in a commercial activity and consists solely of an inquiry or application related to that activity. So I just point out the qualification there, that this has to be a commercial activity in which there is a purpose that is, I guess, mutually shared between the two individuals. You can't necessarily, just because it's commercial activity, then send it out to every business in Canada.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson.
Okay,
thank you, Mr. Wallace. Monsieur Vincent, vous avez... Monsieur Vincent?
Mr. Vincent or Mr. Bouchard? Mr. Bouchard. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, you know that the Internet is all over the world. Spam can happen within Quebec, within Canada, and it can happen outside the country as well. So, we were speaking earlier about the three organizations, the CRTC, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and the Competition Bureau. I'd like to know who would have the authority to intervene. Let's say I get email from outside Canada, and I'm fed up with receiving it. I don't want to give my prior authorization to get email. So, to which organization would I complain? And what's going to happen with this spam that I get from abroad? Will there be effective and efficient measures put in place? Will these organizations be able to intervene when the problem comes from abroad? Well, be more efficient than what we've got at the moment. But in this bill, there is an intent to have the power for the CRTC or the Competition Bureau or the Office of the Privacy Commissioner to share information and evidence with their international counterparts. For example, if there is legislation in place that is similar in other countries. And of course, there's Interpol. And the International Police Force for these issues. So it might be possible to have partnerships on these issues, but for the moment it is difficult for other countries to have such a partnership with Canada, because without this bill, there is no way of establishing a partnership so that we can work together. Shall I carry on? Well, thank you. I understand. I understand that within Canada, it will work better. But when we're dealing with other countries, it's going to be subject to agreements with other countries. So that needs to be developed. Okay, so much for that. Now, I'm going to turn to another subject. Electronic commerce, e-commerce. There are a lot of merchants writing to us to suggest various things. And once the act is in force, each merchant or business person offering things to Internet users will have to get the prior authority to do this, to communicate with people. So let's say the act is in place. And some morning I find that there is spam and I didn't give my prior consent or authorization. I will have to make a complaint. To whom would I complain? And what will happen? And they get my complaint. There's an investigation carried out. Am I informed of the results of that?
About spam, then you could either complain to the CRTC or you could complain to the Spam Reporting Center, which is an organization that we have yet to set up, but would be complementary to this legislation. So if you don't know who to phone, don't worry about it. You can call or email the Spam Reporting Center, and between the three organizations, they will figure out who is best positioned to take action on this. And as you know, a lot of these organizations, well, at least the CRTC, carries on quasi-public proceedings. You would find out what is happening to your complaint from them. And they also have the ability to publish the results of when they find someone has violated the act and there has been a penalty extracted. They have the ability to publish that information for you as well, so you can see that they are being effective.
Thank you, MacDonald. Merci, Monsieur Bouchard. We now have Mr. Van Kesteren.
Mr. Chair, thank you, Minister, for appearing before us. Mr. Minister, we're right in the middle of a very significant global economic crisis. And I'm curious why the government would choose this time to introduce this legislation. And how will fighting spam contribute to Canada's economic recovery? How important is it, in that light, that we get this legislation passed as quickly as possible?
Well, thank you, and certainly I respect this committee's willingness to tackle this legislation with us and to work with us to get the best legislation possible. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this spam costs Canadian businesses $3 billion a year. There's the cost of guarding against spam, of course, that businesses and consumers, we all get our antivirus patches and continue the war that keeps expanding to the next level with the spammers, and that requires constant vigilance and upgrades and so on. So it's expensive. I'm not saying that it's all going to disappear with this legislation. It's obviously spammers, bad guys, are going to be around trying to get around the rules. But the fact of the matter is, there's a big gaping hole in the world right now, and it's Canada. And when you look at, I think the statistics are, something like, if you look at the top 25 spammers in the world, it's something like a third of them are in Canada. They're based in Canada because it's the Wild West here. So I think we've got to do our part internationally. It's hard for us to work with Interpol. As I said to Mr. Bouchard, it's hard for us to work with them if we have no legislation. We cannot come to the table with clean hands in that situation. We're not seen as a good partner right now. So we have to have legislation. It has to be as effective as possible. Is it going to eliminate everything? No. I'm not here to say that. But the experiences of other countries has been, Australia is a good example. When they pass legislation, when they enforce their legislation, their indigenous spam, if you will, dropped by 40%. So it can have an impact, and that means savings for businesses, less frustration for consumers, and that's what we want. Now is the best time to do this in the wake of the world economic downturn.
So I suppose that leads me to the next part of my question: stakeholders. What kind of response have you received from stakeholders and the business community in general? Have they been supportive of this legislation?
Yeah, we've got very positive feedback from the Canadian Marketing Association, for instance, and I'm sure there's a whole list here somewhere. But have you got it there, Helen?
That's a good question.
The Association of Internet Providers has reacted quite favorably to this. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has reacted quite well. Mr. Perrin-Beatty put out a statement after the bill was tabled.
Right. Yeah. So from our perspective, look, there's what they're saying is there's just a quote from a TELUS spokesperson. who says it provides a legal framework to stop Canadian-based spammers from bombarding Canadians with unsolicited messages and potentially dangerous malware. And that's, and Mr. Beattie said that he's been pressing the government for years. Quote, I'm pleased that the government is acting to make the internet safer and more secure. So that's the general impression out there. And certainly, as I say, if there's ways that we can improve this in an expedited manner, I think we're willing to do that as well. But at some point, the process of debate must stop. We've had that for years. We actually have to pass some legislation.
And what about a review date? Is there an automatic review date? Is it 3 years, 5 years?
Would it help?
No.
Would it help to have a is that something we should introduce?
Well, I don't think I'd, I mean, if the committee felt strongly that that's important, I'm not going to throw myself in front of that train. And if you think that that's important to have good legislation, that's fine by us.
Okay. Thank you, sir. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you, Minister.
It might be the way to get them on.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Chair, and that's one of the things we added, amended the do not call list for the review as well, so that, especially as a program's in its infancy, it has unintended consequences regardless of all the things that we do. And sometimes that's good to bring back, so I'm glad that was raised. I want to go back to the real estate example because I just want to make sure I'm clear as to how this works and also another scenario that might evolve. And if we don't have the answer for this today, it's fine. I'd just like to eventually get this, and when we have some witnesses, it'll help. I understand right now, if you sign on with a real estate agent to find a house or sell your house, you could have an agreement there where the real estate agent or anybody in his actual agency could then send an email to you if that scenario comes up where another agent of the same agency wants to send you information related to a search for a house or a sale of your current house. Could that be written in as part of the agreement when you sign up? But they couldn't. What they couldn't do, or to answer that, what they couldn't do is then provide it to some other real estate agent from another entire different agency. So could you have that relationship so you have it with not only just the one agent in the company and all the agents that have signed on to their entire policies and so forth, and then exclude, I guess, the separate ones like his buddy that he just talked to down the road or something like that?
Would it be okay to try to answer this? I think it really depends on how that. I don't know enough about real estate to know whether you're signing on with a specific agent and any of the agents working for the same company are all working towards the same goal. Perhaps during the discussions as you try and establish this relationship with the realtor, that would be covered and that would be part of implied consent. You had used the words, I think, written. It would not require that you have a formal agreement with them as to who could email or call or not. I think it could come up in a discussion, and so long as it was understood, then it would be a form of implied consent. That if some of our sister company or someone else has places in this area, are you interested in hearing about that? Sure.
Yeah, because it brings up a further scenario, and this is why because you have businesses like real estate agents, or you have businesses like insurance agents, and you have businesses like car dealers, say, for example, where they create their own database of people they've been customers with. What would happen in this bill if they left for, and this happens in those occupations, they often move from either provider or company on a regular basis, every couple of years, or it's not uncommon. Would they then have the ability to recontact all their contacts, being that maybe perhaps the persons agreed under the scenarios of the person being at a particular agency, but at the same time, you often actually people, I use the same real estate agent that we've always had, but the person's changed different companies. So what would happen, and once again, if we don't have these scenarios now, but I think it's just important that we go through them.
And let me just say, if you look at Section 10, you've got the definitions of express consent found in Section 10, including under Section 10 sub 4, definition of, quote, existing business relationship. So I'd encourage committee to go through that list. There's also under sub 6 definition of existing non-business relationships. So go through that list, find out whether that makes common sense to you, I think I'm not going to opine anymore because I'm going to get myself into trouble with Mr. Rhoda again. But I'm guessing that part of his question is at least answered in 10 sub 4. But let's go through that and make sure it covers things in a common sense way and meets our objectives.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Mr. Lake, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Want to maybe move to talking a little bit about charities, maybe companies that conduct research, those kind of companies. Maybe can you just talk a little bit about how the protection would affect them so they don't get lumped in with spammers?
There's
charities in particular, probably.
Under Section 10, sub 6, it talks about, say, donations or gifts. It talks about volunteer work. And there's usually an 18-month period that allows that relationship, if you like, to continue. So that's one way in which relationships, what are called existing non-business relationships, are protected.
Okay.
And on the, I think you had talked about political parties. There's also provisions in 10 sub 6 for members of associations or parties, clubs, voluntary associations that also, if you've got a relationship with, also have an 18-month period that allow these kinds of messages to be sent, because presumably it may be an annual event or something else that you might want to protect. Richard? I think the other point we want to be clear about is whether it's commercial or whether it's non-commercial activity, to try and make sure that we're only looking at those things that are commercial in nature. So that might rule out some types of relationships.
Okay. You talked a little bit about the international reputation that Canada has, and it's not a very good one in regards to spam. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how that affects, and I know the Minister talked about this for a little bit, our sort of international cooperation. It's very difficult if you're not meeting the standard to get cooperation. How does the international sort of cooperation piece of this legislation work?
It envisages the three separate organizations, the Privacy Commissioner, the Competition Bureau, and the CRTC, as being able to work with their counterparts. So I wouldn't have described it quite as Interpol. I'd describe it as the communications regulator in Australia would be the counterpart for the CRTC. The communications regulator in Australia is the organization charged with oversight and implementation of their equivalent act. So this would allow, our bill would allow the CRTC to share information with Australia to help Australia apply its own law where perhaps the spammer is located in Canada. We can also work with them to try and make sure that spammers located, it can't be Australia, it must be some other jurisdiction because Australia has dealt with most of them, but with other, say, some European countries, if they have an equivalent, substantially equivalent law, it allows probably them to exchange information with us, which will allow us to help go after spammers from other countries who are targeting Canadians. So it's unless you can share information, you can't really get to taking action against them. And the provision of the bill allows that kind of provision of information and collaboration across these essentially administrative arms of government.
Because I guess there would be no borders when it comes to this, and ultimately the fact that we don't have legislation right now sort of contributes to this idea of Canada almost as a haven for spammers to be sending from Canada to other countries where they have laws, but they can't touch the spammer in Canada? Is that
and we can't help them. Not only can spammers stay in Canada and feel somewhat protected because there are not laws in Canada that allow us to go after the spammer, but it also prevents us from sharing information that could be helpful to these other jurisdictions.
Okay, and I just want to touch, just a changing direction a little bit. Mr. Garneau had talked about sort of casting the wide net, and I think Mr. Rhoda kind of touched on it as well. almost in a negative, and I understand the concerns that they're bringing up there, but I would think that in an area like this where technology is changing all the time, the danger of not casting that wide net, in a sense, is that you're going to be changing your legislation every time technology changes, right?
Yeah, that's, I was saying that rather inelegantly, but that's exactly my point.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lake. Madame Cody.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Minister, and thank you, Ms. McDonald and Mr. Simpson, for being here and for being here so late in the evening. We really do appreciate it. It gives us a good overview of where your heads are with regard to this legislation. First of all, I think there's not a person in this room that wouldn't agree that, you know, spam is harmful and hurtful to industry and to individuals, and we have to do something about it. So I think you have our concurrence in that regard. On this particular bill, there are some challenges that I think, as the Minister has indicated, that we do have to overcome. I guess my first question would be, did a draft of the bill go out to stakeholders, and did you get feedback from the draft?
We did not do a pre-existing consultation on the draft itself. We announced, I guess it was around April 24th, I announced that the bill was there, but we'd had a lot of contact with stakeholders prior to that to get their sense of what was necessary.
And that dates back to, say, the roundtable, the anti-spam roundtable of 2005. Right. Because I think looking at what the roundtable did, the anti-spam roundtable of 2005, this bill goes beyond what the discussions were at that time. So I think Ms. McDonald's point of, you know, she's looking towards our investigations over the next number of weeks would be critical to improvements to the bill, because there are improvements required. For example, the anti-spam provisions that Mr. Garneau, and I'm going to talk a little bit further about that, the address harvesting also provisions, I'm concerned about the address harvesting provisions. As I understand them, it does remove some of the widely accepted, generally applicable exemptions under the PIPEDA legislation, for example. So there are concerns about that, and I'll get to those. There are concerns about the anti-spyware provisions are a bit broad. So there are a number of issues that we're going to have to focus on. Mr. Garneau talked about the extraterritorial provisions as well as some of the remedies. Just let me get to the anti-spam, if you would be so kind, because the main anti-spam provisions are found, I think, in S6, and you've clarified what they are. Under the Spam Task Force Network and Technology Working Group in May of 2005, they had a different interpretation, much more succinct. The bill assumes that all electronic communications, and we've talked about this, of unwanted spam, and prohibits all commercial electronic messages except in a very limited circumstances, where I believe, Mr. Minister, you indicated we'll probably see in the acceptable commercial activity outlined in the regulations. So is that where you're going to put most of these?
Well, there are some found in the actual body,
Section 10.
But others, obviously, we have a catch-all on 6.5 sub C.
Yep.
Yes.
But the scope really does depart from what our international counterparts, the anti-spam legislation, found in other areas. For example, if you look to the EU directive and the UK Act, it talks about direct marketing. The Australia Spam Act and the New Zealand Spam Act define it really towards relating to direct marketing. Singapore looks at direct marketing. Did you consider that narrowing of scope? Because when you look at what your scope is very, very broad, catch-all. We've talked a bit about that. Other legislation around the world, it's absolutely more defined to direct marketing. Okay. Comments on that?
I think part of our concern, and I can ask Richard to speak more directly about what we learned from other countries and their experience. I think we were concerned that if you narrow it too much, people will claim that they are not direct marketing, they are doing something else, provision of information or something else. You want to make sure you capture the kinds of behaviors that are clogging our emails and discouraging people from moving online. So we tried to restrict it to focus on the unsolicited and commercial activities with a series of exemptions that I don't think are tiny, laid out to try and make sure that the legitimate businesses could continue, but that we were actually putting a stop to the kinds of behaviors and practices that were slowing down electronic commerce.
Can I get to a couple of examples? And this is why I'm concerned. For example, if I'm a business and I have to I'm going to send an e-message concerning a product recall or a warranty, for example, of safety or security information, if we haven't been in contact, if it was purchased more than 18 months previous, as I understand it, we're not allowed to do that. It would be considered spam. That's pretty concerning to me because, of course, of warranty and product recall, it would be very, very important to be able to discuss. I have other examples.
Go ahead.
Do you want to handle this?
Yes, thank you. The example you used of a warranty or some form of communication that is relevant to a product, there's two possibilities there. First of all, it could have been express consent when you bought the product, that you always want to have information on warranties or anything related to the safety of a product or anything along those lines. But even if not, implied consent and an existing business relationship would work in that situation. The 18 months time limit is just a way of trying to find some date certainty in terms of when that business contact is stale. But that's a detail that can be looked at. If I could go back, Mr. Chairman, to the question about the Spam Task Force and the work that was done. Having been involved in the working groups and the task force itself, I'm pretty familiar with the thinking of the group. And it's interesting that people like Tom Copeland, who's president of the Canadian Association of Internet Providers, who the minister mentioned earlier, expressed support for the legislation, was a member of the Spam Task Force. Most of those members would see the bill as being very much consistent with the kind of framework that they put in place. However, there are aspects of the bill that you would see in the work of the Spam Task Force that we need to develop in terms of defining the kinds of practices that will be part of the regime of implied consent, for example. The regulations that the minister referred to are going to be used to pick up some of the details that we need in order to make the bill work effectively in a business environment. And specifically in the Spam Task Force report, there was a piece of work that was done by the Canadian Marketing Association. President John Gustafson, another member of the task force. The CMA has come out in support of the bill. And the annex that I'm talking about was a set of industry guidelines for commercial email marketing. And our intention has always been to make sure that those guidelines that were developed by the Spam Task Force and later adopted by the Canadian Marketing Association and endorsed by a number of Canadian businesses, that these would be reflected in the regulations and therefore in the operating principles of C-27 when it became law.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Thank you, Madame Cody. Monsieur Vincent, est-ce que vous voulez poser des questions?
Do you have any questions, sir? Mr. Vincent? The question that bothers me a little is this. You know that with the do not call list and the problem that we had toward the end of last year, the beginning of this year, there were people who were on the internet who got this who got themselves on the do not call list, and they were contacted by the telemarketers. So I understand that what Mr. Clement was saying earlier, that there might be a similar list for the internet so that our internet address would not be available, so that we could avoid having people sending us emails. Of course, this list will be available on the internet. But what about other countries that don't have legislation on spam. They could come to an internet site, purchase the telephone numbers or the internet address the same way as was done with the telephone numbers, and they could get in touch with people and send out spam, do whatever they like. It could be advertising from elsewhere, because there are some countries where bills don't apply. So do you see some way of offsetting that, of using the internet for this purpose? Because we've seen here in Canada that people use this do not call list. If it happened for telephones, I imagine that elsewhere in the world where there is no legislation, they're going to use another channel to advertise for someone else. I would say it is impossible to have a bill or legislation that is going to completely eliminate spam or other electronic communication. We're trying to protect the people as well as we can, but I think that this bill is important because in this way we can be joining with other countries in the world in trying to fight this activity.
Is kind of an opt-out. You put your name onto a list to indicate you do not want to receive telemarketing calls. Mais il n'y aura pas une liste pour l'Internet. There will not be an Internet list to opt out of spam. It's a different regime of opting in, but there won't be a single list created of all Canadians who do not wish to get email spam or unsolicited commercial text messages. So there's quite a difference between those two approaches. Your point about the fact that there is a list and that what happens in other countries who might be able to see this list, I believe that had happened at the beginning, but I believe the CRTC was taking steps to try and prevent the purchase of the names that were on the do not call list.
Thank you, Madame MacDonald. Thank you, Mr. Simpson, and thank you, Minister Clement, for appearing in front of our committee to explain this bill. We appreciate it, and your testimony will be helpful. This meeting is adjourned.